Great. Today, I want to talk about really, I think, on some level, building on what Paula was talking about earlier, energy justice. And I want to spend time really giving some big, I think, top level thoughts on the matter. Let's go to the next slide. Certainly, as the opening mentioned, I've got several hats, but just to emphasize that the standard disclaimer, these are my individual personal thoughts. Next slide, please. To frame the conversation, I want to focus our attention on a few key problem areas. The smallest problem, perhaps surprising to some, the climate crisis. Then turn our attention to energy and climate injustice. Then by way of conclusion, look at some of the solutions that we are trying to implement from a variety of vectors, and wrap up with some three parting shots. Next slide, please. So for some, perhaps, at the Energy Week, this might be the biggest problem. I think from my vantage, it's probably the smallest of the three problems, the climate crisis. Nothing that the folks that are attending today's and this week's events are unfamiliar with. This is IPCC's latest sort of, wrap up, going from top to bottom, the increasing temperature, increasing sea level rise, increasing greenhouse gas emissions, and increasing CO2 emissions. Nothing surprising at all. Next slide. What's bigger than this? Bigger than this is really energy injustice. It comes in a variety of shapes and sizes. This is an example of it on the generation side of the equation, as it were. We see in the United States and in other regions, we see disparities in rooftop deployment along race and ethnicity lines in the U.S. Go to the next slide. On the supply side, you see energy injustice playing out in terms of the location and siting of energy facilities, as it were. We see Native Americans in this one particular example disproportionately proximate to the mining of uranium and all the contamination and pollution that goes along with it. Next slide. Not surprising, and perhaps even bigger than, is I think the biggest problem, as it were, climate injustice. We see some data here of it playing out over the past few generations, almost past 50 years, worsening and concentrating its impact on the global south, as it were, in the developing world. But if we were to blow in that last bar graph, if we were to blow that up, the little thin green line there, the global north, we would see the similar types of global injustice, or rather climate injustice, playing out in the domestic context in the United States. We'll go to the next slide and take a look at that. This is some research by some friends and colleagues at the University of California, Berkeley, and also at USC, Rachel Morello-Frosch and Manuel Pastor, looking at this domestic problem of climate injustice, again, narrowly in the US. But note the date of the research, a decade ago, a little bit over a decade, actually. Next slide. We come a decade into time forward, just a couple of years ago. The rub is still the same, that climate injustice is playing out and impacting communities in the United States in ways that it is playing out around the globe. We go to the next slide, and we see that the rub there is that climate change is really causing unprecedented harm to those on the margins of society, the low income, the poor, elderly, people with what we now call comorbidities, given the pandemic crisis or underlying illnesses, and also on women and so forth. This is the problem of climate injustice actually worsening through time. Been with us, for many, many decades and counting. We go to the next slide. So this raises a question of, well, how do we check these problems? How do we get out ahead of the biggest crisis, that crisis of energy injustice, the even bigger crisis of climate injustice? I think there are four domains that we can put our attention to. And before we go to the next slide, just for folks that will get the slides, I think they're going to be available on the CMU website and so forth. Lots of links to notes and references you can find in the notes sections of the slide. So let's go to the next slide. And then carry on from there. So one solution set is really focused on social movements. We've seen a tremendous rise of social movements. I sit on the C3 board of the Sunrise Movement, which is driving the conversation around not just climate justice and energy justice, but the Green New Deal and so forth, and really keeping I'll say the street heat on those in the C-suites, as it were. Go to the next slide. The efforts of the Sunrise Movement are certainly not limited to domestic activity. Social movements taking a big role and flexing their muscle, as it were, around the world. We see this in everything from Climate Fridays with Greta Thunberg to efforts across the global South, where you have various social movements from countries like Ecuador and in South America and South Africa and in Africa, across Africa. Really, this sort of social movements to deliver and fight for energy and climate justice are playing out around the world globally and having some impact, as we see in the upper left, where some of the results of this have seen the retiring and cessation and shuttering of fossil fuel infrastructure, nominally coal-fired infrastructure in this particular example. This is an example from the US, but that phenomena is taking place and can be magnified around the world. We go to the next slide. And again. So that social movement flexing, as it were, that the street heat, as we might call it, is also driving policy changes and is also delivering, I think, policy changes at a national level. We see this in the case of the current administration. This slide might be best characterized as the precursor to the current administration, where you've got science-based and solution science driving the policymaking in the campaign mode of the Biden administration, to produce the Unity Task Force, which really was called it a progressive left of center compromise discussion within the campaign effort of now President Biden. We go to the next slide. With just 62 days as of today into the first 100 days, tremendous amounts of policies, radically more progressive than President Biden's old boss, Mr. Obama, who was arguably a climate laggard in many ways. Hence why we were co-created and set up Sunrise Movement in the first place, to really hold the old Obama administration accountable and get it to pursue more aggressive policies. Go to the next slide. And again. So beyond social movements, beyond the sort of the policy pushing that we're seeing, we can also make the case for energy justice on the capital side. We're in a new moment now where renewable energy at the unsubsidized level or levelized cost, it is the cheapest way, effective or as of the last quarter of last year, the cheapest way to generate electricity. And we see this played out against other cases of conventional energy in this slide. Go to the next slide. We see this also in terms of prices, whether we look at the levelized price or the unsubsidized prices for wind and also for solar, in essentially a free fall state. Just over the past decade, those prices have collapsed, over 80%, and in some cases, on the PV side, as much as 90% price decrease since over the past decade. So that's enabling wind and solar to lead the way in terms of the most affordable way to generate electricity. Go to the next slide. So again, that phenomena is not just unique to the US. It's a phenomenon that's playing out again around the world. And the next sort of move away from this, and we see this with some examples from different countries, Australia, Brazil, India, and so forth. The next thing that's coming, the next sort of historic moment is when not just where we have generation being the cheapest through the production or through the generation through the use of renewables, but we're going to see that the price continues to fall. So we get into this spot where it's actually cheaper to simply replace old fossil generation with renewable generation, because it'll be cheaper to put in new renewables over top of existing fossil infrastructure. We're not quite there at that price switch, but that we can see coming in the next 5 to 7 years or so. We go to the next slide. So this is that price reality, that price change is really what's driving our business. It's also driving us to think about how we can lean in on the capital side of the equation. We go to the next slide. And again. So ultimately then, if this is sort of the fourth solution, as it were, looking at green capital and particularly justice-based green capital. I think for our vantage, one of the challenges as we look out over the next coming years is that in many markets, particularly in the US, we see those utilities slow walking and outright blocking the deployment of renewable energy. I've got an op-ed in today's Crane's Business Daily for Michigan, the Crane's Detroit Business Daily, talking about this issue. In the state of Michigan, you've got a cap on distributed generation at 1%. That's obviously an absurd reality, but it is as it is. But you can't, that's untenable in the really the short term as well as the medium term in terms of rapidly accelerating the growth of renewable energy. So in order to do this, one of the things that we're beginning to do is partner with some strategic institutional investors as well as philanthropies to basically rapidly accelerate the deployment of renewable energy. We can do that by subordinating philanthropic money in the capital stack of projects on the short term. And then in the medium term, as we see renewables begin to increase and build out faster, we can then leverage that money to basically continue to accelerate the green energy and renewable deployment. We go to the next slide. That approach of really sort of leveraging green capital or justice-based green capital allows us to, I think, catalyze renewable energy deployment in some specific markets. It allows us to, essentially do a focused effort of delivering renewable energy, particularly for low-income and minority communities. And we know that's important because those on the margins of society in the US, as well as around the world, they pay a disproportionate amount of their income for renewable energy and for energy in general, not just renewable energy, but for energy in general. So if we can move critical capital to those that need it the most, we can also help them tackle the problem of paying a disproportionate amount of their income for energy. Go to the next slide. And just one more click here. One more again. And the last one. So just to summarize here, in the 20th century and up until now, we see a situation where the utility bill comes to all customers, but when we inject renewable energy into the equation, we can save on the utility bill because it's the cheapest way to generate, but we can also ultimately reduce the overall bill for customers. And again, that is upside for those on the margins, particularly low income and minority customers in the US. We go to the next slide. So it's these three areas that I want to offer as a sort of a takeaway and give us a time to open up for a discussion on this. If we're going to scale the solution set, we've got to scale those things globally. They're happening to some extent, but we got to continue to push that. We see social movements doing this and working on this problem around the world and sharing information and insights. We also have to see that similarly along the policy variables with an emphasis on justice, whether it is in terms of energy or climate justice, but also getting money to those that need it the most. It's that effort of scaling globally those four solutions that will hopefully deliver the broadest amount of renewable energy justice, as it were, at home and abroad. And then what I didn't really get a chance to talk about was the way in which as we build out renewable energy, we still got to keep up turning down and turning off fossil fuel technology. That's why that growing effort to shut down fossil fuel assets like coal and others is critically important and needs to continue. Last slide. So please be in touch and looking forward to some questions. I see them coming up in the box here, and I think we've got a good 10, 15 minutes to have that discussion.
Michael, thank you so much for that presentation. There are a few questions that are coming in. So one of the first ones that I see is brilliant presentation. What are your thoughts on the Caribbean and Puerto Rico with their energy problems after Hurricane Maria?
So, great question. There's now tons of efforts happening across the region, and also in Puerto Rico in particular. The new governor is a big proponent of renewable energy, and I think it's going to be the new governor of Puerto Rico. That is going to be leading that push. They've been trying to rework, and reconfigure PREPA. That's a big effort down there. They've also stood up the analog to the Puerto Rican chapter of the Solar Energy Industry Association, SEIA, which is the Puerto Rico chapter CESA, run by a great fellow called P.J. Wilson. So there's an active, robust, sort of trade association with lots of members there. Folks that are whoever asked that question, I'd encourage you to check out the CESA website. You can see many of the companies and organizations that are leading the push in Puerto Rico. Across the Caribbean, you've got great new movements, particularly in some particular countries, but also you've got lots of multilateral capital coming to the scene, not just USAID and so forth, but you've got the Get Invest program, which is the EU's effort there, making a real push in the region. So you've got a mixture of national movement on renewables with external bilateral, multilateral players that are also being driven by those, on the capital side, from the SME side up to large players as well. So I think the future is really looking good for the Caribbean and also Puerto Rico. That doesn't eliminate the hurdles. It's certainly not easy to do business down there. We've been trying for a while in Puerto Rico, but I think the overall outlook is quite positive, I would say.
Thank you. Another question. For the many developing countries like India, electricity tariffs are higher for commercial and industrial customers, where solar energy plus storage is a cost-effective solution for reducing energy costs, and thus improves economic inclusion. So how can you share details on how this works with IberSun?
So that's a wonderful question. And we've actually been a part of projects, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but also some in India for that matter, where the client, because our target at IberSun is largely utility scale, commercial, industrial operations, but oftentimes we have clients in those emerging economies that reach out to us for that exact reason, in part because it's cheaper to do generation with solar in our case, but also because some of their industrial processes can pencil when they add in renewable energy. So we've seen that in the mining sector in particular, where a mining project wouldn't otherwise, pencil until they come in with renewables alongside for energy generation. So I think this is a phenomenon that's going to continue to be the case. There's certainly some, I'll say, peculiar paradoxes out there. We've been in conversations with oil producers who want to use renewables to generate oil. That has obviously some downsides in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but it's a real phenomena that I think is increasingly different industry sectors are recognizing and looking towards renewables as a solution for exactly the reasons that the questioner points out.
Fantastic. So I have a request to have you say your email address again.
Sure. Well, the IberSun is MDORSEY at IberSun.es for España. And then my personal one, which it was on the slides, and it's MKDORSEY at aya.yale.edu. You can use either one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So another question, and this is actually one that I've heard before, and I'm not sure if I just want to hear your perspective, but it's the comment is that all renewables are inequitable, that they hurt low income and minority populations. So do you agree with that? And if not, please dispel that myth or tell us kind of your thoughts about it.
So the short answer is that no, that's nonsense. That's the quick answer. So renewables are not inequitable. The reality is that we're coming out of a world where we socialized the harm from fossil fuels. And we particularly socialized that harm disproportionately directly into not just on the backs thereof. Paula's slide, if you remember it, she had the slide of a wonderful, I don't think she named it as this, but there's a vernacular for it, fence line community. You saw in the slide that she didn't name the city, but the community separated by a thin tree line alongside what looked to be a refinery and so forth. So communities that live like that, we know in this country, domestically, they're disproportionately Black and brown and poor. Those are communities living on the fence line, and those corporations simply socialize the harm directly into the lungs of Black and brown people, poor Black and brown people, reducing their life expectancies, causing them untoward amounts of misery, over literally the past century and a half or so. So that is an old, archaic activity from the 20th century, from the neoclassical economics period, when we did that without fail. That's now something that we can actually walk away from. It was utter nonsense when it was happening over the past century and a half, and it's going to remain to be nonsense to the extent we walk away from that. Now, what we have, and this is I think it's a new moment in history and time, where it just so happens that, again, just a quarter ago, electricity generation, the cheapest renewables, the price for renewables are going to continue to fall. And this is going to make it, without doing full cost accounting, without doing ecological accounting and accounting for everything, we're going to see that renewables are not just cheaper, but they can, the benefits from them can also be shared. Right now, we're in a world, particularly in certain markets, certainly in emerging markets, where we have projects in emerging markets where we see north of 20% IRR, essentially venture grade returns on these projects. You could have a situation where you set limits on IRR or ROI caps, and then share off the delta for other sectors. That actually is a way, when you do the real economics for the Green New Deal, is how you can actually pay for it, right? So we're now in a moment, because renewable energy generation is so cheap, that we can share a lot of these benefits in a way that we did not do for all of the 20th century and even the latter part of the 19th. So it's not cheaper, and indeed, or it's not inequitable. Renewables aren't inequitable, but they're actually going to, I'll offer to your audience and your listeners, renewables are going to actually help drive away certain other inequities in society. They have the ability to do that, because right now we're at margin zero on O&M. So we see projects that are paying off much faster. So in a sense, they act as annuities. So we can take some of that money and put it into other sectors of the economy. And we can certainly do that. And I didn't get into the details here on the just green banking. And I think it's important to put that justice and just into the green banking, because if you don't, you'll have basically an opportunity for us. Let's call myself, as I am, solar capitalist, to privatize all these benefits. But if we're going to do justice, financing, justice-based financing, we can share a lot of those benefits with society writ large.
Another question. So can you talk about ideas that you have about how we could improve diversity and inclusion in the energy sector? So there's a lot of conversation about that, and I'm interested in your insights. And I would like to include women in that as well.
Absolutely. So one of the things that I'm a part of and fortunate to be a part of is something called BOSS, which is Black Owners of Solar Services. You can go to blacksolar.org and see the placeholder website. We've just stood that up over the past 2 quarters, and it's going to be I'll say going gangbusters quite soon. We're in the very early stages, sort of the inaugural stages of it. That's one trade association that's going to be coming to fore. We got many members, and the members are sort of growing almost weekly. That's leading that diversification. We have a new partnership that we did a soft launch of with SEIA, the sort of the flagship solar industry trade association in the U.S. Mm-hmm. We've also got other partnerships with developers and so forth. So that's a space where I'll say the opportunities will continue to exist to diversify renewables, but it's also because you've got a legacy of diverse owners of solar services that have been working in the space for years and indeed decades. And so really we're basically putting everybody together to do that. So that's something I think we're going to see more and more of.
Okay.
And to speak to the point about women, 3 of the 6, so half of the founding members are women. And I think that's going to be it's going to be really the norm.
So can you talk a little bit about university partnerships? So a lot of times universities can play in this space. It's a parallel universe sort of to what you're working on, but what can students look forward to in the future with their careers coming up as well?
So that's, I think, is a wonderful question. So one, certainly, there are going to be job opportunities in this, and there already are. Most places, I could only laugh at the sort of the daft that was coming out of Texas with the energy situation during the cold spell that they had. The reality of Texas is that there's more people in renewables now, working in renewables in Texas, than there are in oil and gas. That's actually been the case for many, many years. And it's going to continue to be the case because of the pricing numbers that I showed you. So for students, there's going to be definitely, employment opportunities. They're only going to grow. There's more people working in solar and wind in California than there are in the movie business. So places where you sort of have a stereotypical idea of what the economy and what employment and job opportunities look like, that's changing, and that's changing in part because of renewables. I think additionally for universities, there's a tremendous role for places like Scott Institute to lead on some of the research, both in terms of innovation in materials and products, but also in terms of the economic and policy research. One of the things I think that's driving the current administration is that, they've really had a fire lit under their pants, as it were, not only by social movements, but by smart science and smart policy making that's been led by folks in universities like Carnegie Mellon, but also many peer related universities.
So I think a final question, and we are almost at the end of our day today. So okay. Outside of our reception, which happens at 5 o'clock, so I want to make sure that I give instructions to everyone in a couple of minutes about how to drop off of this Zoom and go on to the Remo platform.
Okay, and I'll be in that.
Where we will have virtual cocktails.
Okay.
See, my virtual cocktail is also not here yet. So tell me about what does it look like 10 years from now? What does it look like 20 years from now? So I remember
great.
when we started talking about, energy efficiency, we were always headed towards 2030. So where are we now? And how do we feel about what 10 years looks like, or 20?
So long before 20, in the next 5 to 7 years. So right now, the cheapest way to generate power is still in the single digit of the energy mix. The renewables are in the single digit percent of the energy mix. In the next 5 to 7 years, they're going to go into, towards 50% quite quickly. It's going to be exponential growth and build out of renewables because they are the cheapest thing to do. In the next 10 years, you're going to see what I mentioned. The cost goes so cheap that it's simply cheaper to build over existing fossil fuel infrastructure, because it'll be more expensive to keep it running. So we're going to see then in that sort of at 10 years, we're going to see that, renewables go into sort of 60-70% of the energy mix. And that's going to radically reshape, I think, political relationships because the politics of this country and really the world are set upon energy politics. So we're going to see a different world from the one that we have now and that we know now. And that's going to happen very, very quickly. That's why we're in this business. That's why we are pushing on these issues.
Dr. Michael Dorsey, thank you so much for your time today, for spending the day with us, and for your insights this afternoon.